There is a strange irony in the modern search for enlightenment. Never in history have so many people had instant access to sacred texts, esoteric philosophies, and hidden knowledge. And yet never has genuine inner transformation felt more rare. Because when everything claims to be truth, truth becomes indistinguishable from performance. The seeker drowns in a flood of symbols, aesthetic mysticism, and recycled mantras, until the original purpose of the path is lost. But the ancient schools were never interested in collecting ideas. They were interested in changing the human being, not by escaping darkness, but by entering it deliberately. This is the first gate of the great work, the confrontation with the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche we've buried, denied, and disguised. Not a poetic metaphor, a psychological reality. And the reason most people never progress is simple. They want illumination without the descent that creates it. The shadow is not merely negative traits. It is everything within you that your identity refuses to admit exists. The emotions you label as unacceptable. The impulses you moralize into silence. The hunger for power you pretend you don't have. The envy you disguise as critique. The rage you rename as principle. And the more virtuous your mask becomes, the more violent your shadow tends to grow behind it. Because repression does not destroy energy, it only pushes it underground, where it gains autonomy. This is why ancient initiatic traditions treated inner work as alchemy, not therapy. They believed the human soul was raw matter, unfinished, and that spiritual gold could only be produced by pressure, heat, and decomposition. Centuries later, depth psychology translated the same truth into clinical language. The shadow becomes the hidden architect of your life when it remains unconscious. It chooses your enemies, your addictions, your relationships, even your moral crusades. If you do not meet it willingly, you will meet it through consequences. Long before modern psychology existed, an older current of wisdom described humanity as living in a kind of inner sleep, hypnotized by surface reality, forgetting the deeper origin of mind. In those teachings, the world is not just matter, it is a mirror. And the self is not just a personality, it is a battlefield of forces. They taught a hard doctrine. The soul cannot awaken by collecting comforting beliefs. Awakening requires a deliberate encounter with what has been exiled from awareness. To the ancient mystic, this was regeneration, the rebirth of perception itself. To the alchemist, it was the beginning of the great work, where the liad of ordinary consciousness is broken down so something finer can emerge. And to the modern individual, raised inside social roles and emotional censorship, this descent is terrifying, because the first thing you discover is that your identity is not whole. It is curated. You are not one being. You are a kingdom pretending to be a single king. This is why the old masters spoke in symbols instead of instructions, not because they wanted to hide the truth, but because direct language cannot describe what happens when the psyche begins to split open. In alchemy, the first major operation is dissolution, the breaking down of the hardened structure. Psychologically, this is the moment you stop defending your persona, the mask you learn to survive, the role you perform so consistently that you confuse it for your real nature. The persona is necessary. Society requires it. But if you live inside it permanently, your life becomes a ritual of self-betrayal. You will be liked, but not known, successful, but hollow, moral, but secretly haunted. And the shadow always forms behind the persona like a rejected twin. Everything you force yourself not to be begins to gather in that underground chamber. The irony is brutal. The traits you suppress become the very forces that control you. Your denied anger becomes passive aggression. Your denied desire becomes compulsion. Your denied weakness becomes cruelty. The shadow does not disappear. It waits. The turning point comes when the shadow stops whispering and starts erupting. Not as a demon with horns, but as patterns you can no longer rationalize. A moment where your reaction is too intense for the situation. A dream that shakes you awake with strange imagery. A sudden hatred towards someone who reminds you of something you refuse to see. A collapse of motivation that no productivity system can fix. This is the psyche forcing an initiation. The unconscious pushing its content into the light because the ego has reached its limits. In psychological terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the slow movement toward inner wholeness. But the first phase is not inspiring. It feels like confusion, like your inner story is breaking, because the ego wants order. It wants control. It wants to believe it is the author. But the shadow reveals something humiliating. You have been living inside a partial self. This is why the first stage often feels like grief. You mourn the person you thought you were, and you begin to suspect that your life, in its current form, may not belong to your deepest nature at all. Once recognition begins, the work becomes voluntary, or it becomes violent. Because awareness creates a choice: descend consciously, or be dragged. The descent is not aesthetic. It is disciplined observation. The slow extraction of truth from your own reactions. You watch what provokes you, what you envy, what you condemn, what you condemn, what you crave. And you ask the forbidden question: what part of me lives inside this? This is the method hidden inside the oldest esoteric formula. The world reflects the inner state, not as mystical fantasy, but as psychological mechanics. When you judge others with unusual intensity, the judgment often points to something unresolved within you. When you idealize someone, you may be projecting your own unlived potential. When you obsessively hate a trait, you may be defending against your capacity for it. This is why shadow work feels like humiliation at first. It forces you to reclaim what you blamed. The goal is not self-hatred. The goal is power, the return of psychic energy that was trapped in denial. What you refuse to own will always own you. At a certain depth, the shadow stops feeling like me flaws and begins to feel like an entity, not supernatural, but autonomous. A psychological presence with its own voice, mood, and agenda. In dreams, it may appear as a figure. A double, a stranger, an enemy. Someone who resembles you but carries an energy you disowned. In waking life, it appears as sudden impulses that feel foreign. Words you didn't intend to say, desires you did plan to feel, sabotage you can't logically explain. This is where most people retreat, because the shadow is not polite. It does not negotiate in the language of your self-image. It speaks in raw emotion, hunger, rage, lust, dominance, fear. But the mature path is not to exercise it. It is to listen without surrendering. The confrontation is a dialogue. The ego must acknowledge the shadow, its reality, while refusing to become possessed by it. This is the first union of opposites. The psyche begins to reorganize. You stop pretending you are purely light, and something more dangerous, but more real, begins to emerge: integrity. This is where the language of alchemy becomes unnervingly precise, because the ancient operators described the psyche as three forces locked in tension: an inner triad that must be purified, separated, then recombined. One force is the fire, the drive, the passion, the will to expand. Another is the fluid, the shaping intelligence, the capacity to shift, adapt, transform. And the third is the structure, the weight of embodiment, habit, and limitation. These were never just chemicals. They were patterns of being. A human life becomes distorted when one dominates the others. Too much fire without structure becomes chaos. Too much structure without fluidity becomes imprisonment. Too much fluidity without fire becomes emptiness. Endless change without direction. Shadow work is what reveals which force you have mutilated to survive. Some people cut their fire to be accepted. Some freeze their fluidity to feel safe. Some deny their structure to escape responsibility. The great work begins when you stop trying to improve yourself and start recovering the parts you amputated. The hidden danger is that many seekers mistake knowledge for transformation. They can recite principles, quote masters, name symbols, yet nothing in their life changes. The authentic tradition never respected theory without practice. It demanded what could be called operational discipline. Test the idea through experience, not through belief. This is the razor that separates inner science from spiritual entertainment, because the shadow cannot be dissolved by reading. It dissolves through contact, through discomfort, through honesty that feels almost surgical. And this is where ethics enters the work, not as social morality, but as psychological necessity. If you gain access to more inner power without refining your conscience, you don't become enlightened. You become dangerous, a manipulator with insight, a narcissist with mystical language, a parasite with spiritual charisma. The great work was designed to prevent this corruption. That is why the old schools insisted on purification before mastery. In modern terms, shadow integration must be guided by accountability. Otherwise, the shadow simply upgrades its costume and calls itself wisdom. Shadow integration follows a pattern so common it almost looks like law, not a straight line, but a spiral. Each cycle brings you deeper into what you didn't know you were carrying. The first phase is projection. Before the work begins, shadow material is not felt as me. It is experienced as them. The cruel are out there. The liars are out there. The weak are out there. And you build your identity by opposing these traits, sometimes with moral intensity. But what you hate in others often contains the fingerprint of what you rejected in yourself. The one obsessed with dishonesty may be avoiding their own self-deception. The one furious at arrogance may secretly hunger for recognition. The one disgusted by weakness may be fleeing their own vulnerability. Projection is the shadow's camouflage. It keeps your self-image clean while your life becomes reactive. And this is why so many modern people feel stuck. They are trapped fighting external enemies that are actually internal fragments. The beginning of awakening is the moment you withdraw the projection. When you admit, this is also inside me. The second phase is eruption. The unconscious does politely request permission. It invades. A dream breaks your self-image. A relationship exposes a side of you you did recognize. A crisis strips away the personality you depended on. And suddenly, the inner world becomes louder than the outer one. This is where many people panic, because they interpret it as failure. But in the logic of the great work, eruption is initiation. It is the psyche saying, you cannot remain fragmented. You begin to realize that you are not the sovereign ruler of your inner world. You are more like a minister who discovered the kingdom has underground cities. And those cities have inhabitants. And those inhabitants want to be heard. This phase often feels like inauthenticity becoming unbearable. You can no longer pretend your role is your reality. You can no longer tolerate your own performance. The old self starts to rot, not because you are broken, but because the shell has become too small for what is trying to emerge. This is why the alchemists spoke of fermentation. the invisible process that begins the moment the substance is no longer stable. The third phase is descent, when you choose to enter the labyrinth instead of merely being haunted by it. This is the stage of deliberate confrontation. You begin practicing a ruthless kind of self-observation, tracking your strongest reactions, your patterns of avoidance, your secret fantasies, your recurring shame. Not to judge yourself, but to map the underground. Because the shadow is not random. It is structured. It forms exactly where you were forced to betray your natural instincts in order to belong, survive, or be praised. So the descent becomes an excavation of your conditioning. Where did you learn that anger was unsafe? Where did you learn that desire made you evil? Where did you learn that strength made you selfish? Where did you learn that softness made you weak? Every culture installs a psychological prison, and every prison produces a shadow. This is why the old initiates treated the path as liberation from enchantment. You are not only confronting personal flaws, you are confronting the invisible programming inside your moral identity. The ego resists because it mistakes dismantling for death, but dismantling is the doorway. Then comes the central ordeal: encounter. The moment the shadow stops being an idea and becomes a presence you cannot escape, you no longer face bad habits. You face the raw animal beneath your civilization, the part of you capable of domination, the part of you capable of betrayal, the part of you capable of cruelty under the right conditions. This is why authentic shadow work is terrifying, because it destroys the comforting myth that evil is foreign. It reveals that darkness is not an external species. It is a human possibility. And here, a deeper layer begins to open. Not only your personal shadow, but the collective shadow. The inherited darkness of the species. The capacity for tribalism, hatred, violence, scapegoating. This recognition is a kind of moral earthquake, because if you admit the potential exists within you, you can no longer participate in righteous fantasies. You become more careful, more restrained, more ethically awake. The old traditions called this the red phase of the work, where blood enters the process, meaning the work stops being intellectual and becomes existential. You are no longer studying transformation. You are paying its price. This is where the dark night appears, not as poetic sadness, but as psychic disintegration. The old identity collapses faster than the new one can form. And the mind asks a brutal question. If my self-image was a construction, then what am I, truly? This stage is filled with death symbolism. Dreams of falling, drowning, burial, dismemberment, ruined temples, abandoned cities. It often feels like meaning itself has been poisoned. Not because life is meaningless, but because your old meanings were too small. Many people try to escape here. They retreat into fundamentalism, absolute beliefs used as anesthesia, or they inflate, claiming spiritual superiority to avoid humility, or they collapse into nihilism, calling emptiness truth, because they cannot bear uncertainty. But the authentic passage requires endurance, to remain conscious in the void, to let the false self die without rushing to replace it with another costume. This is the alchemical death, the necessary decomposition that prepares rebirth. It cannot be bypassed, because whatever you refuse to die will keep you imprisoned. And this is why guidance matters. Not a guru, someone stable enough to hold the chaos while you cross. If you survive the descent, something unexpected happens. You don't become perfect. You become integrated. You regain access to the parts of yourself you feared, not to indulge them, but to govern them consciously. Anger becomes boundary. Desire becomes creative force. Ambition becomes directed purpose. Vulnerability becomes intimacy. This is the real philosopher's stone. Not supernatural power, but inner coherence. A psyche no longer ruled by denial and projection. A person who can hold contradiction without collapsing into self-deception. And with integration comes responsibility, because expanded awareness makes manipulation easier and conscience more necessary. This is why the great work demands ethics. Power without wisdom becomes predatory. But when power and conscience are fused, the individual becomes something rare, a stable presence, a human being who is no longer possessed by hidden forces, someone capable of acting intentionally instead of reacting blindly. And this is the deepest meaning of the Hermetic mirror. As within, so without. When the inner world is reclaimed, the outer world changes, not by magic tricks, but by changed perception, behavior, and will. The gate remains open, but the price never changes. The courage to face what you truly are, instead of what you pretend to be.